Ryan Stanton here with ACEP Frontline, and today once again talking about some politics and policy, and in this case a little bit of our autonomy as emergency physician. So today joined by Dr. Ricky Dhaliwal and Dr. Nicholas Stenauer, and we are going to dive right into it. Session from yesterday. So first and foremost, give us a little teaser on the discussion you all had.
So I think, the biggest thing that we were bringing up was, one, the changing dynamics of EMTALA and enforcement and what that means. And then second, the shift and push from the state level to address some of the issues related to enforcement by creating new legislation that, while good and altruistic, a lot of times is unfortunately written poorly and creates more problems.
Yeah, and as a little trying to read the tea leaves, we noticed there's been a shift and a change in the scope of some of the investigations. And, I personally challenged the reviewers a few times and said, this seems different than what we had seen previously, and we wanted to bring awareness to that, and then also make sure that the folks here can go back to their home institutions and be prepared for inevitably what's going to happen is an investigation will likely come to their facility. So giving them some tools and some foresight so that they can be prepared and not as surprised when it happens to them.
Well, just like most things in terms of legislation, even though this law is now almost 40 years old, it's written in a vague enough and interpreted in a vague enough fashion that it's yeah, well, maybe, no, yes, maybe. Kind of this very kind of vague approach to things. So I think a lot of physicians out there are on their toes and concerned about the potential. And there's always questions. I mean, if you look at some of the social media platforms, EMTALA questions are some of the most common questions that are out there. And it's rarely black or white in terms of the answer. So you mentioned challenging some of those investigations. You're talking about some of those changes that you've seen.
Well, so the reality is the law hasn't changed, and that was the concern, right? It's the people who are doing the work on the ground who have taken it upon themselves, and I'm not trying to, insert my opinions into the way they approach their work, but there is more of a clinical judgment analysis as opposed to did we violate EMTALA? And as you said, it's nearly 40 years old. We're all taught EMTALA principles, and classically it's uninsured patients who we're sending out, and untoward outcomes happen because we didn't provide that stabilizing care. I think most of us understand that is something we should do. It's the right thing to do for the patient, and we'll continue to do that. Now what we're seeing is some of these complaints that are coming in. These are insured patients who were seen, got full workups, and discharged, and it's clinical judgment after the fact. Another diagnosis comes up, and now they're saying, oh, maybe you should have done more. To me, that doesn't seem, certainly not the classic understanding of, hey, here's a classic EMTALA violation case. This is more, it's blurring the lines of a peer review sort of issue, that now we have a government agency coming in and opining and then slapping a penalty if they find you as negligent or not satisfying those requirements. And that to me seemed like a change. And one of the auditors even said that was the old EMTALA, to which I said, I didn't realize there was new legislation. EMTALA is the same as written in 1986. So, one of the things that I predicted sort of in jest is it was 40 years prior to that the Hill-Burton Act was passed in 1946. So 40 years later, we get EMTALA. Next year is 40 years. Is some huge shift going to happen? Is something else going to change that will ultimately shape how emergency care is delivered in the United States? And I think the answer is certainly could.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's an interesting aspect of it, because I've heard about some of these changes where it becomes more of almost the kind of the malpractice / review of care, as opposed to did you provide the care? What we're seeing is a lot of now is a little bit more of that gray zone of we never at any point, or a department, physician group never refused to take care of somebody. Maybe that's overcrowding, boarding, delay in care, whatever it may be. And so looking at it and saying, going completely against what it was, which was an anti-dumping law to say you can't just dump somebody because they can't pay. And I think everybody in emergency medicine is supportive of that, that everybody should have access to emergency care. But now, as you mentioned, like, what did you do? And can we say that if something develops 2 weeks or 10 years down the road, that was part of the medical screening exam that you should have picked up? So kind of bounce into that, Ricky, and kind of where you kind of see this and where the potential risk for emergency physicians.
I think there's a couple different pieces here. So I think one, as Nick was saying, enforcement, each state has their own agency that is in charge of enforcement in terms of an EMTALA violation. And with that, you also get different interpretations of what is important for that agency. And so, depending on where you practice, you may have more issues related to them trying to assess clinical care than they're actually assessing EMTALA related violations. And then the second, and I would say second and third piece on this is the risk of new legislation. I use California and Colorado's examples. In California, they passed a law in 2019 which has really strict requirements in terms of discharging patients, specifically unhoused patients, which from a emergency medicine perspective, it's important, but there was no financial mandate on the state to actually pay for places for the unhoused to go, or the people to social workers, case managers to actually do this work. And so what it's done is it's created more boarding, a larger issue that's at the downstream effect. And in Colorado, that's a really prime example of a fear of lack of enforcement for reproductive rights. And what started out as a bill that was going to be related to reproductive rights became a whole new EMTALA, a state level EMTALA. And when you think about that, that's been around for 40 years, and there is case law, litigation, regulatory pieces that all go with that. And if you are recreating this at a state level, it creates a whole level of complexity if it does not completely align with the federal EMTALA bill. So, I see this is likely going to happen in more and more states across the country as we have a change in administration. And, I think you'll see this probably in more blue states than red states as legislators try to protect their specific state citizens. And so, this is going to create probably some uncertainty within medicine, specifically emergency medicine and EMTALA related care. But, the biggest thing that we can do is making sure that we use our voice at the state level with our legislators, local legislators, to ensure that they understand the implications of what they're doing.
And that's interesting. You mentioned the state levels because, of course, living in Kentucky, the reproductive rights trying to go the other way. And that's, you mentioned the red versus blue as they're kind of diverging, and the current passions of whatever parties in control of each particular state kind of guides which direction some of those policies go. And it can be very difficult as a physician who learned medicine, and medicine theoretically is not red nor blue, it's science, of then going to a state and saying, how do I have to change my practice because of the legislature that's been here and the passions that they have for their constituents and not necessarily for the betterment of medicine. And so I think that's a huge challenge coming out. So, to kind of roll in, we'll kind of hit both of you on some of those tips for physicians out there, with this changing landscape of, potentially because even with EMTALA, with the regional medical directors that they have and inspectors they have and the differences they may have in their interpretation. And that's the challenge with these vaguely written laws without definitive yes or no's, is the fact it is open for interpretation. And we've seen that with the signs, the no violence in the ED signs. In some places they're considered a violation. Other areas they're considered just fine. My department has one in it that says we will not tolerate violence against healthcare professionals. Which I believe should be there. But, and then we had another one in other area of the country that said, no, you can't put that out there. So what are some tips for emergency physicians to kind of keep themselves safe when it comes to the fact that the ground we walk on may not be as solid as we think?
Yeah, and it's not, I don't want to send a message of hopelessness because we do have power. And I think it's important for us, one, to be aware so that we can advocate locally and collectively. but two, so we can prepare our teams. And I do think there is a place, and we've seen examples where the recommendation from the regional office was this is a violation, and we were able to challenge that and have it overturned. So there's a mechanism for that. It is a pain. It is resource intensive. You have to it's a lot of work, right? It takes a lot of time from the C-suite at the hospital, the local team. It's back and forth, but it can be done. Ideally, you want to avoid these things. So doing what we do, having our North Star of provide great care and do the right thing for your patient. If you do that, it might get messy. Someone might challenge it, but I think in the end, you're going to come out clean. So that would be, if there's one takeaway, it's do what we do and do the right thing and advocate for your patient. If it's the right thing for them, that's what we should be doing. And I think, if someone wants to challenge that, that's fine. We'll have, that course backed by experts and others, so that you come out with that sort of conclusion that, hey, you did the right thing. Because you're right, the rules are going to change. The interpretation is going to change some. I think, you can't necessarily predict what a reviewer is going to say or think, but what you can do is in real time, make sure your team is prepared, knows the rules, and educates them. And it's not just clinicians. We saw a security guard who tried to give well-intended advice, but it violated EMTALA. So making sure that everyone in the department that would have contact with a patient is familiar with EMTALA and its rules and principles, I think would be a takeaway. And that's one of the things we tried to message yesterday is when you go back, do you have an onboarding process? Do you have an annual update on EMTALA and its requirements? Or, honestly, we should probably broaden that to, hey, here's the changing landscape locally and nationally. Make sure our team at least has awareness and what impact that has on what they do at the bedside.
Yeah, I think Nick hit on all the big pieces. I think that the only other piece I would add is doing the right thing, but also documenting that you're doing the right thing. I think that with the way that the busyness of emergency departments right now and kind of the chaos, sometimes we forget just simple things, simple documentation pieces can make all the difference. And so ensuring that you are doing the right thing and then showing that via documentation as well, I think can go a long way.
And I think at least when I started in emergency medicine, your concern and threat of EMTALA was turning somebody away at the ambulance doors or en route or whatever. And, the last investigation I know of at my facility had to do with when the cath lab was shut down and a tech tried to advise, but the EMS agency was already there. And none of us as the physicians even knew it happened. But, I think now the biggest risk for us a lot of times in emergency medicine is the boarding resulting in longer wait times. That you have full intention of doing a full MSE on these patients, but they're in the lobby and they may deteriorate. And, that's where I'm hearing of a lot more potential EMTALA violations now is you didn't provide the MSE, an adequate MSE because you had them wait in the lobby. And so one of the challenges where all of this rolls together, because we did the interview yesterday based on boarding and those types of things, and now we're seeing how that potentially could expose us to EMTALA violations, medical malpractice risk, and everything else. So as we close today, kind of where we are status-wise with everything else and how that may potentially expose you to higher risk and physicians needing to advocate in their departments to kind of help others understand that potential risk.
So, obviously that's a big question, right? I think that one of the things that I have a feeling we're going to see more and more of is state-led initiatives and state-led legislation because, obviously the federal level is going through a transition. We'll say, I'll put it nicely, and we don't know where it's going to end up, right? And so I think, from an emergency medicine physician perspective or just a physician perspective, I think the area that we can really help change the way things are being done is at the state level and at the hospital administration level. And so really educating those around us, educating our legislator are, two huge things. But then the other part on this, is, having that voice within the hospital system. I think it's really important that we point things out to not just our patients, but also to the hospital administration if there are things that are putting patients at risk. You know, we have a voice, and while we contract with hospitals, at the same time, we can have these conversations in ways that are not detrimental to our relationship, that are centered on the patient, and I think that will make a huge difference.
Yeah, and you know, when there's an opportunity, let's capitalize on it, right? So we have these examples, we've talked about it. Everyone knows of a case that's a real vulnerability for all of us that have boarding. I think that is a nice segue to say, hey, here's an example of a like facility that had this problem and got cited with a 6-figure fine. We don't want to be next, whether that's your med exec committee, whether that's, you know, a PI group for the hospital that includes some of the inpatient teams. Have that conversation and use this as sort of a catalyst to say, we should protect ourselves now. What can we do to minimize boarding, to improve efficiency on the inpatient side as well as the ED, so that we protect ourselves as best we can, so that we're not sitting at a table drafting a response on an EMTALA complaint.
And I feel like that a lot of times that's as Ricky mentioned, the legislation. Often the legislation is the result of a sentinel event or something that's happened. You know, we don't want to have to see a knee-jerk reaction to something that's happened in the emergency department in terms of legislation. How can folks get in touch with you all if they have any questions, thoughts, like regarding this and want to pursue it further?
Yeah, feel free to email me. Give my email address on your podcast piece, and they can get in touch with me. I'm happy to answer any questions and help in whatever way I can.
Yeah, likewise, email or my cell phone I can provide to you as well.
All right, and as for me, you can contact me, rstanton@acep.org, rstanton@acep.org. Talking with Dr. Ricky Dhaliwal and Dr. Nick Stenauer, and here at LAC, talking about some of the legislative policy and potentially interpretation changes that may impact us as emergency physicians. Make sure that you're liking the podcast, downloading on the weekly basis. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ryan Stanton, and this has been some ACEP Frontline.